Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings from New Zealand. It's my pleasure and a privilege to present on behalf of Working Group 5 a health and safety planning guide published in 2020. Apologies for the recording, but it'll be about 3:30 a.m. in New Zealand when you're watching this, and that's too early for me. Donald Lamont will be live in the session to address any questions as Working Group 5 animateur, and as anybody who knows him and has worked with him will know, he really is the authority in health and safety in tunnelling. The presentation will emphasise the key points of what is intentionally a very short and hopefully accessible guide and a reminder of the importance of planning for health and safety and well-being in terms of preparedness and thereby good tunnelling risk management. There's nothing really new here, but it restates some useful planning principles so that tunnelling procurement can be focused on the most efficient use of resources and not in untangling ambiguous health and safety requirements. It is, as the Maori proverb says, about the people. For most client organisations, whether they're formed especially for a single programme of works or if they have extensive underground assets, the construction, operation, maintenance and refurbishments of tunnels is a special higher risk set of activities. Amongst many things, this is because of the confined space risks. Hopefully anybody who's watching this will be familiar with the hierarchy of controls. The emphasis of the guide is intentionally towards client organisations as they are in the best position to influence project risks by establishing the project requirements and the systems for managing risks, the scope, the context and criteria of ISO 31000. But in a practical and real sense, they also select the size of the underground spaces and its position in space, the horizontal and vertical alignment, and thereby how well the ground conditions are investigated. There are many other aspects, of course, that affect the ultimate risk profile, but probably the most important of which is ensuring there's a sufficient budget and contingencies, and in selecting the design and construction partners to incentivize and collaborate with. Just note that PPE is at the bottom of this triangle. So why do we prepare the guide? We were mindful that sometimes the implications of health and safety risks are not rigorously appraised prior to tendering. In this way, the guide seeks to raise awareness of the benefits of establishing clarity on what the health, safety and well-being requirements are in terms of the client's organisation's risk criteria. It does not promote a universal standard, albeit if the principles are considered, it should contribute positively, and that is the document's overall intent. The guide was inspired by Syria 79 from 1976, and that's currently under revision by Syria, ISO 31000 and the ITA Code. It started in a cold marquee tent in Naples when Werner Berger, the vice animateur, started sharing some of the difficulties he'd seen during bidding and some of the problems that clients and projects suffer from because the implications of health and safety were not properly thought through. So we identified a gap. It's not a how-to guide, but it has a focus on client-side program risk management. This slide is essentially a recap of health and safety planning process that most will be familiar with, and it starts with the identification of hazards or risk sources, and those terms are interchangeable in the document. Then these risks are either eliminated or accepted and managed, and then the controls that are provided are assessed in terms of their effectiveness. Acknowledge there's some debate around ALARP and SOFARP, but at their core, the key issue that is generally agreed is the concept of what is reasonably practicable, and we'll come back to that shortly. The guide presents some definitions, and I'll go over some of those now. This definition is fairly self-evident, and who would want incompetent people doing responsible things? A concept that's being reinforced in the third revision of the IT Code in particular. Of these fairly hopefully self-evident bullets, the last bullet is probably the most important. It's all very well having knowledge and skills, but if you can't act, then you can't really contribute to risk management. Client organisation is the final owner of the facilities to be constructed. We suggest in the guide that they should take responsibility for the creation and maintenance of a project-wide risk and safety culture, and increasingly this includes the requirements for data management. They provide the works information that specifies and describes the works the contractor is to provide and any constraints, and they should take responsibility for the adequacy and suitability of the designs that they prepare, or if they're prepared on their behalf, and this includes the quality assurance requirements and the independent design checks. When tenderers give them construction methodologies, they should critically review these from a health and safety perspective and independently, and they should define the supervision requirements during construction and commissioning of the project. So the designer, fundamentally they should be competent, and we've already talked about that, but they should be aware of how things are constructed and constructability in particular. We note that significant design decisions may be made by the clients, and that significant design activities, temporary works for example, could be undertaken by the contractors, and these are significant sources of risk potentially. A key matter for a designer is not just defining the limits of their design, but communicating those limits, and also how the necessary observations will be made during construction to validate the design assumptions. So the contractors are the people that make it happen, and ultimately where most of the credit should go for a successful project, I think. I just note that clients' health and safety criteria may be improved by a contractor. And ultimately they're responsible for safe construction of designs, whether or not they control the design process. So reasonably practicable, there's a number of combining factors within that. People have a reasonable expectation of favourable conditions of work, and this minimum level of protection defines a maximum level of acceptable risk. When you work through the risk management process and the tolerability and what's unacceptable and what's acceptable with controls, you come across the concept of what more could we do to improve the risk profile, and a clear decision point about why we haven't done it in a particular circumstance. There's an aspect of awareness there in terms of what the state-of-the-art control measures might be. The guide sets out that a risk control is reasonably practicable if the costs and risks of implementation are not grossly disproportionate. This isn't a new concept, we've just restated it. But the definition of gross disproportionality comes from the client risk management criteria and framework. And by way of guidance, we're suggesting that an order of magnitude for cost, if the risk control measures versus consequence are within an order of magnitude of each other, then it's reasonable to undertake them. There's a risk prompt list in the guide, and I'm not going to go through it, but you can't really talk about tunneling risk without talking about geotechnical conditions, the old enemy, to quote Sir Alan Muir Wood. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. Air quality, the awareness of silica, it's a class 1 carcinogen, whether that's from excavation or post-construction drilling into concrete, or even from shotcrete. This is something that goes in and doesn't come out. In the same vein, we're still looking at diesel for underground plant for a while yet, and there are some very sophisticated monitoring systems out there, and the two images I've got in the slide here from PINSAR, who specialise in diesel particulate matter monitoring and controls. Fire is ever present as a risk underground, and the risk of concentrated energy sources, whether these are chemical or electrical. There's increasing advances in systems for personnel and plant tracking, and linking these to egress systems and lighting systems. General point being, there's a lot more data being generated now, and this needs to be integrated in order to make sense of it, and it brings up the concept of information partnering. So something that the client can specify that it wants access to, and can share in the understanding of the risk profile. We make some recommendations in the guide, so I'll just go over these very briefly. In the planning and design phase, we recommend the client establishes a health and safety risk management framework, the scope, context and criteria, and assess competence for procuring, operating and maintaining underground assets. They should prepare a reference design with an objective of making sure that it can be constructed safely. And when they select a design partner, they should be confident that they understand the construction process well. The designers in turn should allow for constructability constraints. And the reference design that's assembled and perhaps forms the basis of a tender should be considered as a minimum requirement. When it comes to actually tendering, we think that clients should incentivize improved health and safety risk management. There should be time in the tender process for interactive assessment and comparative evaluation. Clearly, the clients should assess the competence of construction organizations. We're agnostic about whether basic competence is assessed at a pre-qualification stage, of course, but particularly where there's novel or alternative design and construction methodologies, this may require a subsequent step. An important part, and probably at the core of the reason the guide was written, that we don't think a commercial advantage or disadvantage should be created if a tender identifies a flaw in the reference design. And what we're saying is effectively the requirements should be shared, the playing field should be leveled. At the same time, and to follow on from the first bullet, if somebody does come up with something that's superior in terms of health and safety risk management, there should be a mechanism to acknowledge that. To conclude, clients have the primary responsibility by creating the risks, and their decisions through planning and tendering have the greatest influence in achieving good health, safety and well-being performance. It's not sufficient for clients to seek to transfer ambiguous risks for contractors to manage. Providing a clear, common basis and minimum requirements for health and safety risk management will avoid undesirable tender interpretations. Good communication, collaboration, and a systematic approach to integrating the data generated throughout, the concept of information partnering, is increasingly significant for risk management. I'd like to acknowledge our animateur, Donald Lamont, the comments and support from working group colleagues in drafting the guide, and our EXCO sponsor, Arnold Dix, especially in some of the definitions. And also to PINSAR and Maxwell Geosystems for some of the images used. Thank you for your attention. Hope the guide will be useful.